Hello everyone, my name is Amna Sohail. I'm here to present on the topic of transforming healthcare through building AI capabilities and partnerships. And this topic is very relevant right now, especially as executive teams across the board are making some critical decisions on AI transformation, from should they build in-house capabilities or buy or partner emerging entrants in the market. And particularly in industries like healthcare, which is the topic of interest for this presentation, it can get especially challenging because it's regulated and has some additional nuances to consider as well, which I'll dive into within this presentation. So for this presentation, I'm focused on how healthcare executives should think about evaluating and implementing the right strategies to drive AI transformation. And because healthcare is so vast, I'm going to be focusing on opportunities within the payer, provider, and pharmaceutical segments, because those are all interconnected and are also of interest to myself. And there are three areas we're going to focus on, three guiding questions. The first is foundational understanding. How is AI transformation different from previous digital transformations we've seen in the past? Second, relevancy to the business. Where is AI going to be the most impactful, and how is it going to benefit the key stakeholders being served? And then third, implementation strategy. How should the company decide to build, partner, or buy to develop these AI capabilities? And what are the critical decision-making factors when deciding these things? So diving in, I'd like to expand on my key findings in each of these three buckets. So starting off with foundational understanding, what I found is that AI transformation isn't much different in terms of the considerations you have to adopt AI versus previous technologies. But there are a new set of challenges with AI adoption, particularly around how data is shared and used. And then when we look at healthcare particularly, there are a new set of challenges ranging from rising costs and also physician and nursing staff shortages that are pretty unique to AI that can actually be positively impacted by AI, from augmenting the physician's role to supporting diagnosis and treatment recommendations. On the second bucket, with relevancy to the business, leaders should really consider two areas, which is driving innovation potential and efficiency gains when they're looking at use cases. The most ideal applications will prioritize both. By prioritizing efficiency gains, you get greater adoption across the organization, and by prioritizing innovation potential, you're creating long-term competitive value for the firm. And then secondly, companies should also look at how can the AI applications they're going after ultimately augment capabilities rather than replace capabilities, because that's going to create more impact for the firm long term. And then third, once you get to the implementation step, companies should really look at four key criteria. First being strategic alignment, second being internal buy-in, third being feasibility, and then fourth being AI governance, which I'll go over later in the presentation. And only after these four criteria are met should a company then proceed to make the decision to build, partner, or buy. And companies oftentimes will choose a multitude of these approaches in the build, partner, buy model based on their strategic goals, the resources they have available, and then also just the existing competitive pressures in the market, among other factors. So with that context in mind, I want to dive into each of these three questions. Focusing on the first, building a foundational understanding. I went through a lot of this in the previous slide, but one thing I want to touch on is a point I made earlier, which is the fact that AI adoption isn't really different from any new technology adoption, but the main key difference is that there are a set of new emergent challenges, particularly on how data is shared and used. There are new sets of questions to ask around how do we reduce data silos? How do we think about changing data access? And thinking about not like, is its data accurate, but like what sets of questions can people ask from this data? And then also defining new success metrics. And like I mentioned, AI can solve a lot of these tough, wicked challenges in healthcare, and it's uniquely positioned to do so, from being able to augment the role of the physician or nursing staff to driving efficiencies in processes and supporting diagnosis and treatment recommendations, just to name a few potential benefits. Secondly, we go into understanding relevancy to the business. There are two main questions that healthcare leaders should be asking when they're thinking about potential impact to the business. The first is key priority. Is this the priority to drive innovation or efficiency gains, or both? And then second, is there an augmentation opportunity? Is there an opportunity to augment a key stakeholder's capabilities? And then just to expand on the first question, key priority, on the right-hand side, you'll see this matrix which has innovation potential on the vertical axis and then efficiency gains on the horizontal axis. And here you can kind of see a representative sampling of where different use cases across the pharma, which is in green, payer in blue, and provider in red, kind of fall in this matrix. And one thing I want to point out is that it's much more ideal for companies to be in that top right quadrant, where they're focusing on kind of optimizing for both innovation potential and efficiency gains. Again, like I mentioned, innovation potential, optimizing for that creates longer term competitive value for the firm, and then efficiency gains helps to create more adoption. More likely, from what I've seen from my research and interviews, a lot of companies fall in that bottom right quadrant where they're trying to optimize for efficiency gains because they're trying to improve productivity, they're trying to reduce administrative burden, and it just is a lot easier to adopt and get those quick wins. So ideally, companies will start to shift from that bottom right to the top. And then on the second point of augmentation opportunity, one thing to think about is one thing that stuck with me at the AI conference last year was a point that a speaker, Slater Victorov, mentioned that the most impactful AI use cases will turn users into superheroes by augmenting their capabilities, not replacing them. So when we think about challenges, for example, for the provider segment, take the physician, for example, right? Administrative burden and just physician shortage, how could we think about augmenting their capabilities when they're interacting with patients day to day? One opportunity might be, for example, thinking about using a chatbot in between visits to monitor for adverse events and kind of extend kind of the interactions outside of the patient and patient-doctor kind of office visit. Another could be kind of, ambient clinical intelligence, being able to take notes to kind of give them more time, quality time with the patient rather than having to be bogged down in taking notes that go into EHR. So those are two important considerations when you're thinking about what's most relevant to the business. And then third, once you have that understanding of what's relevant to the business and where's the most impact going to be and for who, we can talk about the implementation strategy. So on the left-hand side, there are 4 key, what I call stage gates that have to be fulfilled before you can even think about making a build partner buy decision. The first is strategic alignment. Is this project or use case aligned with the company's objectives? And is there an inherent strategic advantage? Second, on internal buy-in, is there internal buy-in and support? Meaning, are there resources? Is there funding? Is there a dedicated team? And then third, on feasibility, is a project feasible? Have there been any pilot or use case studies done in the past? Does the company have access to the data? And then lastly, but very importantly, AI governance. Does the company have a governance structure in place and ethical guidelines to monitor regulatory compliance, to monitor the implementation and how explainable the AI applications are? And are you mitigating biases? Is there, are we monitoring potential risks? So those are actually really important considerations under that AI governance piece. And once all those 4 kind of criteria are met initially, then the company can start to consider the build buy partner kind of decision. So on the right-hand side, I kind of put up a couple of different considerations for each of those. So generally, a company will choose to build their own solution if it fits into their core strategy, gives them a competitive advantage to build it themselves, if they have the inherent internal capabilities, whether that be technical capabilities, access to the data, talent, and also the infrastructure. And then lastly, the company should have the time to develop it. It's not super urgent. They actually have time to develop it. That's another consideration for building it internally. Secondly, companies will consider partnering if, with an emerging startup or a third-party vendor, if the solution is core to their strategy, but maybe they don't have the internal capabilities to do it, or maybe that use case isn't actually core to their business and it would just make it easier to just partner. And usually the partners will help provide some sort of advantage, whether that be data or technical infrastructure or expertise. And there usually needs to be definitely alignment in strategy, mission, and vision for both the partner and the company. And then lastly, companies will typically buy a solution if it's pretty urgent from a competitive standpoint to get that solution into market, and also if it's commoditized and off the shelf. One example I'll give is contact center summaries. One company, Highmark Health, has actually bought solutions off the shelf because it's a lot easier to do, and it's not something that's very customer facing. And one point I made earlier on this note is that it's not just exclusive to just company will just take one approach. Oftentimes they're employing multiple approaches. So I mentioned Highmark Health. It's in the insurance space. They take several approaches. I mentioned the example of contact center summaries. That's something where they're buying an off-the-shelf kind of solution, But when it comes to things that are very member-facing, personalized communications to their members to help them understand their benefits or communication to specific populations, those they're building in-house. It's a lot more core to their strategy, and they have the expertise in play. So just to bring it all together, I wanted to give two specific examples of companies in this space that are implementing AI solutions and how they're approaching it, given the framework that I just talked about. So the first one is Bristol Myers Squibb in the pharmaceutical space. One AI application they're going after is designing and executing more efficient clinical trials. And I'm going to walk through just really quickly the four kind of step framework. They do have the strategic alignment because it impacts their drug development value chain. They do have the internal buy-in and support internally. There is feasibility. In fact, in this case, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. You'll see they're going to be partnering because they have these multi-year clinical data science collaborations in place to get access to the data. And they do have AI governance in place because they only work with partners that have access to robust, high-quality data that can capture the latest standard of care. And so in this case, as I mentioned, BMS in this case is really taking the partnering approach for this use case because while the application is very core to their strategy, they just don't have the internal capabilities in place to make it happen. So they work with partners like OCIN that help them optimize their clinical trials. And then secondly, Aetna in the health insurance space, one use case they were going after is what's called the Next Best Action Program, which is to guide members to make better health decisions by using their health records and also data analytics. And this application directly ties into their strategy, especially around their objectives to reduce costs and improve member outcomes. There is internal buy-in. It is feasible because they've got the clinician expertise, they've got the internal talent and the data sets to make it happen. And they do have governance in place because there's definitely strict standards around protecting the health information. And in this case, they chose to build it because it's core to their strategy and they've got all the inherent internal advantages to make it work. So those are just two examples, and like I mentioned, companies will often employ a multitude of these approaches. And with that, I want to end and just see if anyone has any questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
Do you have any examples of when you're talking to companies in your research where they did a poor job of implementing AI because of the things that you listed out in your steps?
Yeah, I would say one thing that comes to mind, and maybe this might be in here. It might not be in here. But I think as I was talking to companies, I think looking at those 4 stage gates, oftentimes one thing that would come up is just like that last bucket of AI governance. A lot of companies, it's very new for them to actually develop this out. One company I mentioned Highmark earlier. They're pretty sophisticated in that they actually have like a vendor questionnaire that they go through for every partner to assess how they're doing, like if there's potential risks, the quality of the data. And that's not something that a lot of companies are quite frankly robust on or even understand the importance of. And I think that's something where it's like, in the short term, they might think that they're doing well, but in the long term, the impacts it might have to the people the people who these applications are being designed for could be very detrimental. And I think that's actually like one thing that I haven't seen very robust in a lot of companies that I talk to. Highmark was just one example where they were being super, diligent about it. Even had people hired on their team focused just on AI governance, which I thought was impressive. But that's something that I didn't see across the board for a lot of companies. Is there another question? Oh, go ahead.
Did you see any thoughts on how the culture of the company itself impacts maybe the way the pilot works or the structure or choosing whether that's the important part of how they work right now and do they need to change something?
Yeah, I would say at a high level, what I saw most was just kind of comes to the point that I mentioned on like having internal buy-in. I think like having support from the top, having dedicated resources is actually echoes what Tom was mentioning earlier. Like not just having people work on it part-time, but actually having dedicated people working on it is what tended to be much more successful, and not just like something where they just run a pilot. Like there's definitely several companies I came across that would just get caught in that kind of, I like to say like a pilot purgatory, just because they just didn't have dedication around it or kind of just strict measures on what they're considering success. So I think having the leadership support, having a dedicated team, and then actually having a vision for on like what's considered success and how do we move forward are all key ingredients to the culture, but not every company kind of was strong in those areas. Yeah.
You had a point on an early slide saying that like augmenting rather than replacing is going to give like more long-term value. Can you maybe just walk through in some detail about like why that is that like augmenting gives greater long-term value?
Yeah, I think one thing to think about is that it comes a lot through just like thinking about the psychology behind it. Because oftentimes, I think one of the fears with AI is that it's going to replace us. And I think when you think about it from like just say a physician perspective, considering like this example within healthcare, like no one wants to think that they're going to be replaced, that they're not going to be valuable. But really, where this greater sticking point is how do you make it so someone feels like their abilities are being much more augmented rather than them being replaced. So in my opinion and the research that I did, it comes a lot more from a psychological standpoint. And more likely, you're going to get people to want to buy in if they feel like they have an opportunity to do better work, to do more meaningful work. In the case I mentioned with like how you could augment it for a physician, right? Like if you could find a way to use AI chatbots in between visits, if you could use kind of AI to take notes so that they could spend more time, a more quality time with their patients, that's only going to make their job better, but also free up administrative burden that they don't need. And so that's kind of the kind of focus on augmentation. It really does come from a psychological point of view.
Thanks,
Awesome.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you.